January 20th, 2020, Aguililla, Michoacan. A joint operation involving the Mexican Army, the National Guard, and Michoacan State Police is closing in on a target. They know who he is. They know what he did. 13 state police officers massacred in a single ambush just 3 months earlier. 13 men wiped out in what survivors described as an absolute killing field, with bodies scattered across the road and burning patrol trucks lighting up the mountain.
The man they're hunting is one of El Mencho's most trusted killers, a cartel commander so close to the top of CJNG that El Mencho personally deployed him to protect his own hometown, Aguililla, Michoacan. The land El Mencho was born in and refused to let any rival cartel touch. And here's the part that makes this story different from every other cartel story you've ever heard. This man, this CJNG killer, who massacred 13 cops, who ordered his crew to flay the faces off rival cartel members and record it on camera, who ran a gang of sicarios through some of the most terrifying violence in modern Mexican cartel history, used to be a circus clown. No cap, a literal circus clown. Painted face, big shoes, making kids laugh under the big tent. His name was Fabian Urbino Morales, and the cartel world knew him as El Payaso, the clown. He kept the mask. He just changed what he used it for. This is the story of how a man who started his life entertaining children in a circus became one of the most feared killers in all of Mexico. The man El Mencho trusted to hold down his birthplace, and how his reign of terror came to an end on January 20th, 2020, when the army finally knocked on the right door. El Payaso wasn't just some low-level street soldier doing runs for the CJNG. This was a man with a direct line to the organization's leadership. He was deployed to Aguililla specifically, El Mencho's hometown, a municipality in Michoacan's Tierra Caliente that CJNG treated like sacred ground. You didn't operate there unless El Mencho trusted you personally. The fact that Fabian Urbino Morales was the man sent to protect that territory tells you everything about how the organization viewed him. But here's what really went down. El Payaso wasn't just a loyal soldier. He was a weapon, the kind of operator that El Mencho recruited because of how he killed people. Not just the fact that he would do it, but the specific, calculated, psychological horror of the way he went about it. CJNG wasn't looking for shooters. They were looking for people who could terrorize an entire region into submission. And El Payaso, with his clown mask and his crew of identically masked sicarios, was exactly that kind of tool. The ambush on October 14th, 2019 didn't just happen. It was the product of years of recruitment, radicalization, and deployment through Mexico's underworld. To understand how El Payaso got to that mountain road with a body count of 13 police officers, we gotta go all the way back to the beginning. To a circus tent somewhere in Mexico, and a young man named Fabian, who had no idea what his life was about to become. Let's rewind to the early 2000s. Fabian Urbino Morales is working a legitimate job. Born around 1982 or 1983, possibly in the state of Chiapas, according to some sources, he's a young man from a humble background making a living the only way he knows how, performing. He's working the circus circuit, doing clown acts, entertaining crowds at events and functions. He's got a nickname that he earns from his work, El Payaso, the clown. At this point in his life, the name just means what it says. Now, the details of exactly when or how Fabian crossed over into the cartel world aren't fully documented publicly. What we do know is that his entry point was family. His brother, known by the aliases El Jaguar or El Burro Gris, was a former military man who had already crossed over into organized crime and joined CJNG's elite Delta group. El Jaguar was operating as a lieutenant in Aguililla, Michoacan, giving him serious rank inside the organization. When your brother is already that deep in, and you're coming from poverty, the door to that world opens fast. Fabian didn't walk through that door alone. He went in with a mindset shaped by the circus, the understanding of how to perform, how to project a persona, how to make people feel something. But now the performance was terror, not entertainment. And the costume he kept wasn't the full clown suit. It was the mask. He started his criminal career working under El Jaguar's structure in Aguililla. But here's where it gets crazy. Fabian didn't just follow orders and stay in his lane. He gravitated toward one of the most extreme cells operating in that part of Mexico, a group called Los Metros. Now, before we get into Los Metros, let's talk about what Aguililla actually represented in the CJNG world, because this is important to understand the rest of the story. Aguililla, Michoacán, is a small municipality deep in the Tierra Caliente, the hot land, a mountainous region along the border of Michoacán and Jalisco. It's avocado farming country. It's also where Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, was born and raised. CJNG treated Aguililla like royal territory. The idea of any rival cartel having a foothold there was completely unacceptable to El Mencho on a personal level. This was the land he came from. Whatever happened elsewhere in Mexico, Aguililla stayed CJNG, period. That context matters because it tells you why El Mencho cared so personally about who he put in charge of that plaza. Now, Los Metros originally came out of Tamaulipas, on the other side of the country, a faction that had roots in the Gulf Cartel before eventually aligning itself with CJNG. And Los Metros had a reputation, not just for killing, but for how they killed. They were executing rivals by burning them alive in gasoline drums. They were using chemical methods to destroy bodies. They were documenting their violence on camera and circulating the footage deliberately, not as a mistake, but as a message. This was psychological warfare dressed up as murder, and Fabian Urbino Morales fit right in. He built his own crew of clown-masked sicarios within the Los Metros structure, multiple killers wearing identical clown masks, moving through Tamaulipas and eventually Michoacán as a unit. Reports from Tamaulipas confirmed that CJNG-aligned gunmen were being seen posting videos of themselves in clown masks as early as this period, wearing full tactical gear with those painted faces underneath the body armor. It was one of the most disturbing tactical aesthetics anyone had seen in the Mexican drug war up to that point. And on his social media accounts, which he ran publicly, with what can only be described as a cartel boss's arrogance, Fabian switched from posting circus photos to posting himself with weapons, gold-plated .38 super pistol, designer clothes, luxury sneakers. He was proud of and not hiding from anyone. This is important because it shows you what kind of person El Payaso was. He wasn't operating in the shadows. He was performing. The same instinct that made him work the crowd in a circus was now driving him to brand himself as one of the most recognizable and feared sicarios in CJNG. He wanted people to know who he was. He wanted the mask to mean something. El Mencho noticed. Here's where the story shifts from regional sicario to personal asset of the most wanted man in Mexico. When El Mencho heard about the way El Payaso and his crew were executing rivals, burning bodies in drums, flaying faces, recording it, and putting it online, he didn't flinch. He recruited him directly. El Mencho's entire philosophy was built on strategic, performative violence. The kind of violence that doesn't just kill an enemy, it makes every other enemy in a 100-mile radius reconsider their life choices. El Payaso wasn't just willing to do that, he had already been doing it on his own. CJNG brought Fabian Urbino Morales into the fold under the command structure of a regional CJNG lieutenant named Miguel Fernandez, who went by the alias LM2. LM2 was running CJNG operations in Aguililla and the surrounding Tierra Caliente area, the mountainous, hot climate region straddling Michoacán and Jalisco that had become one of the most violently contested pieces of territory in all of Mexico. The Tierra Caliente is where the avocado money flows, where the drug cooking labs hide in the mountains, and where CJNG was locked in a brutal war with a coalition of rival groups called the United Cartels, which included La Familia Michoacana and Los Viagras. Only Fabian was sent to Aguililla itself. His broader Los Metros crew stayed in Tamaulipas. El Mencho specifically deployed his best clown-masked killer to hold down the land where El Mencho was born. Think about that. Out of everyone in CJNG's massive organization, out of every sicario, every commander, every regional boss, El Payaso was the one trusted with Aguililla. And El Payaso used that trust to run one of the most brutal intimidation campaigns in Michoacan's recent history. He wasn't just killing rivals. His crew was capturing members of La Familia Michoacana, torturing them on camera, and releasing the footage. One video that circulated on Borderland Beat and other narco-tracking platforms showed a victim, widely believed to be a La Familia Michoacana member, with his face completely and methodically flayed, skin removed, lips gone, eyelids gone. The man was still alive in the footage, making sounds that people who watched it described as something they couldn't unhear. El Payaso was present during these sessions. The torture was his work. This is the environment he was running in the months before October 2019. Aguililla was his plaza. He was holding it for El Mencho with maximum force and maximum brutality, and the war with the United Cartels was escalating to a breaking point. But that's not even the crazy part. The October 14th attack that finally brought El Payaso down happened on the same day, the exact same day, that Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador was receiving a security briefing in the National Palace in Mexico City, where his cabinet was presenting their current law enforcement results to the president. Almost 600 kilometers away, El Payaso's crew was setting up the ambush that would make every word of that briefing irrelevant. The CJNG had been tracking the movements of a Michoacan state police convoy operating in El Aguaje, a small township inside Aguililla that CJNG considered part of their protected territory. The accusation CJNG was making, according to narco messages left at the scene, was that these officers were working for the United Cartels. Whether that was true or not, almost, doesn't matter to understand why the attack happened. What matters is that CJNG, and El Payaso specifically, decided to send a message that nobody who entered their territory uninvited would leave standing. The trap was laid. The convoy drove into it. October 14, 2019, a convoy of Michoacan state police officers is moving through El Aguaje, a small, rural community tucked into the mountains of Aguililla municipality. It's broad daylight. These are uniformed officers in state police vehicles, conducting what should have been a routine operation. El Aguaje sits inside a municipality that CJNG has been declaring their own with increasing aggression, roadblocks, narco messages, intimidation of local residents. CJNG has been signaling for months that anyone who enters this territory works for them or doesn't leave it. The state police convoy either didn't know that or thought their uniforms and badges changed the calculation. They didn't. El Payaso's crew was already in position. The CJNG unit had set up an ambush with military precision, multiple firing positions, cover on multiple sides, coordinated to cut off any escape route for the convoy. When the attack started, it was immediate and overwhelming. Police officers never had a position to fight from. Audio leaked from survivors, and emergency calls makes the chaos completely clear. You can hear officers screaming, "They took us all down." You hear a voice saying, "I'm dying." The shooting doesn't stop. The patrol trucks were set on fire. The kill zone was total. When it was over, 13 Michoacan state police officers were dead. 9 more were wounded. The CJNG left narco messages at the scene accusing the dead officers of being United Cartel collaborators. It was the single deadliest attack on police in Michoacan in recent memory, and one of the bloodiest single engagements in the state's modern history. The aftermath photos showed burned patrol vehicles and officers' bodies in the road. The images went nationally viral within hours. Every major Mexican newspaper led with it. The federal government was forced to respond publicly. This wasn't something that could be managed quietly. 13 uniformed state police officers killed in an ambush was a national crisis. Mexican President López Obrador called it very regrettable. The Michoacán Secretary of Public Security confirmed the full death toll. Federal forces were immediately mobilized to reinforce Aguililla, and behind the scenes, investigators started working backward, tracing the attack through the CJNG command structure in that region, following the chain of command up through LM2's organization until they got to the man who ran the operation on the ground, El Payaso. But El Mencho's man in Aguililla didn't run. He stayed in the area. Maybe he felt untouchable. He'd been operating openly in Aguililla for months, holding the plaza with total impunity. And his boss was the most hunted man in Mexico who had still never been caught. Maybe he calculated that the heat would pass. Maybe he just didn't have enough of a warning. Whatever the reason, when the Army and the National Guard came back to Aguililla 3 months later, in January 2020, El Payaso was still there. By January 2020, federal and state investigators had built their case. They had identified Fabian Urbino Morales as one of the key commanders under LM2 who directed the October 14th ambush. They knew he was still in the Aguililla area. They had his identity confirmed, including the connection to his brother El Jaguar, the former Delta Group military man who had been one of El Payaso's original entry points into CJNG. On January 20th, 2020, a joint operation involving elements of the Michoacán Police, the Mexican Army, and the National Guard moved on the target location. This wasn't a small sweep. This was a coordinated multi-agency takedown built specifically around bringing in Fabian Urbino Morales. The operation succeeded. El Payaso was arrested along with 10 other cartel members who were taken into custody at the same time. No dramatic last stand. No helicopter pursuit through mountains. The man who had ordered the slaughter of 13 police officers, who had run a crew of clown-masked sicarios through some of the most disturbing violence in Michoacán's history, was taken off the streets in a coordinated military sweep 3 months after his biggest operation. The official charge, Tiki, Wainakwi Swarpers, participation in the armed attack that killed 13 Michoacán state police officers on October 14, 2019. What happened in the investigation afterward tells you how El Payaso fit into the broader CJNG structure. Investigators confirmed he was operating directly under LM2's command structure, and that LM2 himself had been captured on audio, recorded giving the order for the sicarios to kill the police officers and instructing them to leave a narco message at the scene. LM2 was identified as a major asset to the CJNG organization, and his capture and the capture of El Payaso were described as significant blows to CJNG's operations in Michoacán. What also came out in the investigation was a clearer picture of exactly how El Payaso had been running his operation in Aguililla. He wasn't just responding to threats. He was proactively running a terror campaign designed to break the civilian population's will to resist CJNG authority. Any local farmer, business owner, or resident suspected of passing information to rival groups or to police was a target. Any rival cartel member who showed up in CJNG territory was a target. And the methodology wasn't just execution, it was publicized, documented execution designed to circulate online and reinforce the message that CJNG's grip on Aguililla was absolute. The arrest also revealed something about how El Payaso had been living during his time as plaza boss. According to Mexican media reports, before he became a target, he was openly posting on social media, flexing weapons, cash, and designer goods under his own identity with essentially zero effort to conceal himself. That level of public arrogance is a signature of CJNG commanders who feel completely protected by the organization's reach. They operate with the assumption that nobody is going to come for them because of who they work for. El Payaso felt invincible in Aguililla, and for months after the October 14th massacre, he was right. 3 months of complete impunity in the town, where he had just killed 13 police officers. The only thing that ended it was a determined multi-agency operation with federal military backing. But here's where it gets real about what the arrest actually changed and what it didn't. On the streets, CJNG didn't stop fighting. The war for Aguililla continued. By April 2021, CJNG was attacking Michoacan police with explosive drones. Drone bombs rigged with explosives dropped on officers who were trying to clear CJNG roadblocks outside the city. A BBC report confirmed the drone attack wounded 2 officers. The tactic was unprecedented. Cartel warfare had evolved to the point where they were running drone bombing campaigns against police, in the same town where El Payaso had run his ambushes just 18 months earlier. And El Mencho himself, the man who had personally trusted El Payaso enough to make him Aguililla's gatekeeper, remained completely free. He would remain untouchable for another 6 years after El Payaso's arrest, right up until the pre-dawn raid in Tapalpa, Jalisco, on February 22nd, 2026, that finally killed him. As for Fabian Urbino Morales, the circus clown who became a cartel killer, is reportedly still in Mexican federal prison. And according to one Mexican narco news outlet, the only performances he gives now are clown shows inside the prison walls. El Payaso's story changed how Mexico and the world understood CJNG's recruitment model and what made the cartel so uniquely dangerous. Every other major cartel in Mexico recruited from specific pipelines. Former military men, street-level gang members, people with existing criminal networks. CJNG did all of that. But they also actively sought out the most psychologically extreme individuals available regardless of background. El Payaso's story proves it. A circus clown from humble origins who had no traditional cartel connections except a brother in the organization, and El Mencho personally elevated him to plaza boss of his own hometown because of how he committed violence. That's the CJNG model in one story. El Mencho wasn't just building an army, he was curating a collection of the most tactically brutal human beings available in the Mexican underworld, dressing them up in paramilitary structure and pointing them at whatever needed to be destroyed. The other thing El Payaso's story reveals about CJNG is the role of documentation in their strategy. His crew wasn't just committing violence, they were filming it, packaging it, and circulating it deliberately. The torture video, the clown mask aesthetics on social media, El Payaso's own posts showing off weapons and cash. This is a cartel that understood media and understood how fear travels through digital networks. El Mencho had built an organization that used social media the way a PR department uses press releases, except the content was footage of atrocities designed to make rivals, civilians, and law enforcement understand the cost of resistance. El Payaso was one of the most active practitioners of that strategy within CJNG's ranks. The clown mask was his brand. And that brand spread fear across Tamaulipas, Michoacan, and eventually internationally once the footage started circulating on narco monitoring platforms and eventually mainstream news channels covering cartel violence. And then there's the professional clown community's response, which sounds almost absurd in context, but is actually a legitimate part of this story. When El Payaso's identity and methods became widely known, professional clowns in Mexico publicly condemned the use of clown imagery in cartel violence. They held press events distancing the profession from what Fabian Urbino Morales had done with the costume they shared. The fact that a drug cartel sicario had so thoroughly weaponized the aesthetic of a children's entertainer that working clowns felt the need to formally disavow any association tells you something about the cultural footprint El Payaso left behind. The clown mask angle isn't just a wild detail for a documentary thumbnail. It was functional psychological warfare. When residents of Aguililla or Tamaulipas saw armed men in clown masks rolling through their streets on pickup trucks with rifles, the effect was exactly what El Payaso intended. It was wrong in a way that short-circuits normal human processing. Your brain sees a clown and expects comedy. It gets a weapon instead. That dissonance is terror on a neurological level. El Payaso understood that before he ever fired a shot. He learned it performing. The October 14th ambush he orchestrated became a reference point for how aggressively CJNG was willing to engage the state. 13 officers dead in a single operation in El Mencho's own hometown was a deliberate message to the Mexican government. CJNG controlled that territory and would massacre anyone who entered it without permission. The audacity of doing it the same day the president was receiving a security briefing wasn't a coincidence. These organizations track government movements and time their statements accordingly. What El Payaso's arrest represented in the bigger picture was a crack in CJNG's armor in Michoacán. LM2 was compromised. El Payaso was gone. The leadership structure El Mencho had built to hold Aguililla was fractured. But CJNG's response, drone bombs, roadblocks, continued warfare, showed that even with key commanders arrested, the organization had the depth to keep fighting. Taking out El Payaso didn't take out CJNG in Michoacán. It just made them angrier. Today, Aguililla is still a contested zone. The Tierra Caliente has been one of the most violently fought-over regions in Mexico for years, and that hasn't changed since El Payaso went to prison. La Familia Michoacana is still operating. Los Viagras still exist. The United Cartels Coalition CJNG was fighting in 2019 hasn't disappeared. What changed is that the man El Mencho sent to hold that ground is now behind bars, and El Mencho himself is dead. Killed in February 2026 in a military operation just like the ones his own cartels had been massacring for a decade. El Payaso's legacy, if you can call it that, is the story of how CJNG turned a circus clown into a weapon of mass psychological terror, and how that weapon eventually got picked up and put back down by the same government it had been tearing apart. The mask was memorable enough that his story spread internationally. People who cover the Mexican drug war still reference El Payaso when they talk about CJNG's approach to intimidation because nothing in the cartel world before him had that specific combination of absurdity and horror. A clown who makes you laugh is harmless. A clown with an RPG and a video camera who has just killed 13 cops and is still holding the plaza 3 months later is something entirely different. Mexico spent a decade learning that lesson about CJNG as an organization. El Payaso was one of the most extreme individual expressions of it. And somewhere in a Mexican federal prison right now, Fabian Urbino Morales is reportedly still doing his clown act, just for a very different audience than the one he started with. The big tent is gone. The costume is gone. The mask that meant so much to his criminal persona is gone. What's left is a man who made some of the most consequential and devastating choices in Michoacán's recent history, and is now living with those choices inside a cell. The 13 officers who died on October 14, 2019 in El Aguaje left behind families, wives, children, parents, people who got a phone call that afternoon telling them their husband or their father or their son wasn't coming home from a routine patrol in the mountains. That's the human cost sitting at the center of El Payaso's story that can get lost when you focus on the spectacle of the clown mask and the cartel theatrics. 13 people died on that road because Fabian Urbino Morales decided their lives were less important than holding a plaza for El Mencho. And El Mencho, the man he was holding it for, is dead too now. Killed by the Mexican military in a pre-dawn raid in February 2026. The empire El Payaso helped protect from a prison cell is now leaderless, fracturing, and fighting itself. The war El Payaso was a soldier and ended with his commander dying on a military helicopter, bleeding out over the mountains of Jalisco. 59 years old and running from soldiers through the forest of his own hiding spot. The circus for El Payaso is finally over, and so is the organization he gave everything to protect.